Welcome to the Lucky Shots podcast with your host, Ricky Larson, presented by Lucky Shots Media.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome into the Lucky Shots podcast. I am your host, Ricky Larson, and cue the sad music. After a long, hard-fought, injury-filled up-and-down season, I have been defeated in my League of Record playoffs. So please raise your glasses to the injuries, the misfortunes, and the bonehead trades that have made this season on my behalf. Moment of silence as well for the team formerly known as Feelin' Tyfreaky. And we're back. And again, welcome in. This week on the show, we will have your boomers, some panic room, some fantasy or reality, trust or bust, and we may even dive into some matchups this week. But let's get started with some news and notes.
Breaking news and notes from around the league.
Starting out, we have Deebo Samuel left the game early with a hamstring injury and did not return. This is part of what tanked one of my playoff matchups. I had Deebo in my flex. I debated on putting in Brandon Ayuk. I did not. Ayuk went out there and scored 21.9 fantasy points, and Deebo scored 0.9. Deebo is unlikely to return for the rest of the season. And just a little update, in this playoff matchup, had I put in Brandon Ayuk instead of Deebo Samuel, I would be winning currently by 9 points instead of losing by 12. Luckily, this playoff format, I have another week in this league to move on to the next round. So hopefully putting in Brandon Ayuk will help me somehow get through to the next round next week. Moving on, Raheem Mostert got an MRI on his ankle on Monday. He's questionable to return. The MRI hasn't come back yet, or they just haven't let us know what's going on. But it is doubtful that he will play this coming week, which means somebody to go pick up because he's, again, 99% rostered, or not rostered, but available would be Jeff Wilson Jr., who is probably going to take a bulk of that load with Raheem out yet again. Mike Williams left the game early with a back injury last week. He is questionable to return this week. Noah Fant left the game early due to illness. He, again, is questionable for next week. Matt Stafford left the game early. I believe it was his ribs. The Lions want him to play. He wants to play. So we'll just have to see how he progresses throughout the week with that injury. Alex Smith left the game with a calf strain. I believe it's on that same leg that he broke and had to rehab on. So hopefully he's able to get back out there for Washington. If not, Terry McLaurin, Logan Thomas, both those guys' fantasy values probably drop more if Alex Smith is not in this week. Brandon Allen left the game with a bone bruise. Gardner Minshew and Jalen Hurts actually are due to start again this week. Jalen Hurts, he's a guy that possibly is someone you can go pick up. He's still heavily unrostered, and with some of the quarterbacks that we may talk about in Panic Room, Jalen Hurts could be a guy that we look at. Mike Gesicki with his shoulder is doubtful to play this next week. Definitely hurts if you have Mike Gesicki because the last couple of weeks, I believe he's got 2 touchdowns in both games, and has really helped you out in that tight end area. if you don't have Travis Kelce. Brandon Cooks is to return this week. Still not completely a foregone conclusion that he will play, but that could also be big if you have him back in your wide receiver room. Ronald Jones had a finger injury in the last game and is having surgery to put a pin in his pinky finger. So doubtful that he will play this week. Chris Godwin had that same procedure done, and he missed that next week following. So Ronald Jones probably will be in the same boat. And then Christian McCaffrey may play again this season, Coach Matt Rule said, but I also may win my own playoffs, which isn't going to happen. So I don't think Christian McCaffrey is going to be back in at least this week. And honestly, if they are going to be smart about it, they have no chance to make playoffs. They just might as well keep Christian on the sideline, just for his own health, and hopefully we get that Christian McCaffrey that we all wanted next year, going into our fantasy drafts. That is it for news and notes. Let's move on to your boomers of the week.
Boom, boom. Players of the week, baby.
All right, for your boomers of the week, we start out with Lamar Jackson. Finally looked like the MVP Lamar Jackson that everybody wanted to see, in a game that was absolutely incredible. So fun to watch. You know, he actually even left the game for about a quarter, with cramps, it was said. Don't know if it was really cramps, if he was back there getting an IV, doing an ice bath, or if he was back there taking a number 2. He had a teammate tweet out that possibly Lamar was back there taking a poop for about a quarter, and then came back and played absolutely amazing. But however it happened, he comes out after Trace McSorley goes down, drives him down the field for a touchdown. Baker Mayfield comes out, drives the Browns down the field in 40 seconds to take the lead with a touchdown. Or no, they tied it up with that touchdown. And then Lamar drives the Ravens back into field goal range. Justin Tucker kicks the field goal, wins the game for him. But absolutely amazing showing. Lamar had 34.92 fantasy points. I believe it was 2 rushing touchdowns and then a long pass touchdown to Hollywood Brown. So, fun game to watch. Lamar Jackson finally showing that he is still a good football player. Moving on to number 2, you had Aaron Rodgers at 30.9 points. Number 3, Baker Mayfield, that same game with Lamar, had 30.02 fantasy points. Number 4, we had Tua Tagovailoa actually going out and putting up a decent fantasy day, something he hasn't done since he's been a starter. But he put up 27.04 fantasy points, and he's a guy maybe with his matchups coming up, could be a guy that continues to be this top 10, top 15 type of guy. Then you had Drew Lock. As a Bronco fan, where was this Drew Lock for the whole season he's been playing? First game with no interceptions and had 25.6 fantasy points with 4 touchdowns. Drew Lock finally looked like a quarterback, and the Broncos actually looked good for once in a football game. Then you had Mitch Trubisky at number 6 with 24.98 fantasy points. Derek Carr at number 7 with 23.84 fantasy points. Russell Wilson at number 8 with 22.14 fantasy points. Number 9 was Teddy Bridgewater with 20.42 fantasy points. And at number 10, you had Jalen Hurts with 19.28 fantasy points. We talked about Jalen Hurts earlier. And the fact that he went out and played as well as he did against the team that he did gives you a lot of hope moving forward. Plays, I believe, Arizona this week. And, Hurts is kind of like a Lamar Jackson. He gives you that running ability, the running possibility of points. And he can also throw the ball. He threw the ball pretty well in this last game. So Jalen Hurts, I think, could be, again, somebody that you could possibly pick up and just roll the dice on, especially if you need a Hail Mary of some sort of possibility you could get a big game. For the running backs, the man who sunk me in my league of record this week, Derrick Henry, was number 1 with 36.2 fantasy points. Number 2 is Jonathan Taylor with 30.5 fantasy points. We'll talk about him a little more later. At number 3, you had Miles Sanders with 29.6, and that number, I believe, is inflated. He had an 82-yard touchdown run. Other than that, didn't do anything, but gave him a 29.6 fantasy point game. So another top 10 for Miles Sanders. At number 4, you had Kareem Hunt with 29 fantasy points. Upsets me that he outscored Nick Chubb. Had Nick Chubb scored that 29, I'd be a little less behind in my secondary league. But Kareem Hunt had a great game. At number 5, you had Mike Davis with 26.3 fantasy points. And I think you just keep rolling with him because CMC's probably, if the Panthers are smart, not coming back for the rest of the season. At number 6, you have David Montgomery with 24.5 fantasy points. I believe we'll talk about him a little later as well. At number 7, you have Nick Chubb. Scored 24.3 fantasy points. He had 2 touchdowns, I believe, in that game. So, Nick Chubb just keeps doing Nick Chubb things. At number 8, you had Austin Eckler with 23.6 fantasy points. At number 9, you finally have Alvin Kamara back in the top 10 with Taysom Hill as his quarterback with 22.1 fantasy points. And at number 10, Cam Akers with 21.4 fantasy points. And we will also talk about him a little later. Your wide receivers this week, number 1 was Stephon Diggs with 29.1 fantasy points. Really hoping that does not continue in my secondary league where I am playing against Stephon Diggs. The man needs to not catch so many passes. That'd be great. At number 2, Allen Robinson. Mitch Trubisky and Allen Robinson, that's just a good match. And Allen Robinson has been taking advantage of it lately. He had 27.3 fantasy points. At number 3, Calvin Ridley had 26.4. At number 4, Tyreek Hill. Really could have used another 70-point game from him. That would have been fantastic. But he only had 26.1 fantasy points. Still top 5. Still a great game from him. Number 5, you got T.Y. Hilton with 25.6 fantasy points. Number 6, you got Devontae Adams with 24.5. Number 7, A.J. Brown with 24.2. At number 8, DeAndre Hopkins, 22.6 fantasy points, and KJ Hamler right there with him. And then at number 10, Brandon Ayuk with 21.9. I need something else like that from Brandon Ayuk this week to keep any of my playoff dreams alive. But we will see. Your tight end rankings this week. Travis Kelce, shocker. Number 1 with 27.6 fantasy points. At number 2, you had Mike Gesicki with 23.5. At number 3, TJ Hawkinson with 16.3 and Irv Smith Jr. right there with him at 16.3. At number 5, you've got Robert Tonyan with 14.6. Number 6, you got Darren Waller with 14.5. Mark Andrews at number 7 with 12.8. Number 8, you got Jared Cook with 12.7. At number 9, you got a guy that I bet none of you know unless you watched the game or you're a Jacksonville fan. But Geoff Swaim, interesting name there, but 12.4 fantasy points. And Jimmy Grandpa getting back into the top 10 with 12.3 fantasy points. Those were your boomers this week. Let's move on to a nice fun segment called The Panic Room.
It's time to panic. Let's enter the panic room.
All right, welcome into the panic room. There's some players we had high hopes for coming into playoff time that really let us down. Aaron Jones, Justin Jefferson, Deontay Johnson, Justin Herbert. Not to name any names, but in round one. But is it time to panic with these players if you somehow were able to get through their terrible week and move on to round two? But let's discuss. So you got Justin Herbert. The guy has had 3 weeks of just terrible production. 16.44, 4.36, and 15.72 in his last 3 weeks. That all consisting of 3 touchdowns and 4 interceptions. He's got Vegas, Denver, and Kansas City coming up. I have to keep rolling with him, so no, I'm going to say it's not time to panic. You just got to keep rolling with the kid. But it's 3 divisional matchups to finish off the season. He played well against Kansas City before. All 3 of these teams he's played or had decent games against before. But you're just really hoping he can get back into that 20-point range. That's actually what I traded for him for. I traded for a consistent at least 20 points a week. And since trading for him in my league of record, it had not worked out. Again, I would just like to say some of those bonehead trades I made, got rid of Josh Allen as a quarterback, and even before that, got rid of Aaron Rodgers as a quarterback. Had I kept either one of those guys, I think I'd still be in my playoffs. But, things happen. I've been salty about it. I just need to stop. So Justin Herbert, I think you're fine with him. You don't have to panic quite yet, but if you get into your championships and he has another terrible week, there's somebody you could look at that we talked about earlier, Jalen Hurts. But we're going to go with no panic on Justin Herbert right now. Tom Brady is next on this list. Last week he had 196 yards and 2 touchdowns, only 15.64 fantasy points. And in the last 3 weeks, he's only averaging 16.6 fantasy points. That consists of 7 touchdowns and 4 interceptions. He's got Atlanta coming up, then Detroit, and then Atlanta again. I don't think you panic on Tom Brady either. He's playing against Atlanta twice, so those are just good matchups as is. And Detroit, you would think is a good matchup, so I think Tom Brady will probably crack 20 points the next 3 weeks at least, if not more, against 2 pretty bad defenses. So Tom Brady, no panic. Deshaun Watson, he's had less than 20 fantasy points the last 2 weeks. And he's playing Indianapolis next week and then has Cincinnati and Tennessee after that. Last time he played Indy, it was 19.4 fantasy points. I don't think you need to panic on him either because, 19 to 20 fantasy points, depending on what your expectations are, is just fine. But Against Indianapolis, I don't see him going over 20. Against Cincinnati, he'll probably have a great game. And then against Tennessee, who knows? Tennessee, yeah, who knows? But I say no panic on Deshaun Watson. Moving on, we have Aaron Jones, another player that tanked for me this past week. He only had one big play against Philadelphia that gave him his big score. Without that, he wouldn't have had the 30-point game that he had. And he only scored 10 against Chicago, and then a measly 9.5 against Detroit. And as I said, he would have only scored about 10 points against Philadelphia without that 73-yard touchdown run. He has Carolina, Tennessee, and Chicago coming up next. And I think he hit the panic button on him for the sheer fact that Green Bay does not realize what Aaron Jones is and will not give him the ball and will split carries with himself and Jamal Williams. So unless he just randomly takes a touchdown or a run for a touchdown for 73 yards, he's probably going to sit at this 10-point mark. So I think you possibly think about benching him, or you put in somebody like Cam Akers, because Cam Akers is going to get a big workload, and if he gets a touchdown on top of that big workload, you're looking at nearly a 30-point game. As with Aaron Jones, you don't know how much he's going to get the ball. You can't count on a 70-yard touchdown every week. So, yeah, hit the panic button on Aaron Jones. Raheem Mostert, yeah, you hit the panic button on him. Don't even need to go into the stats with that. Questionable with an ankle. His last 3 weeks have been 10.3, 5.3, and 9, all underperforming what he actually is. You know, the matchups are Dallas, Arizona, and Seattle. But if he's not playing, hit the panic button on him. Go out and get Jeff Wilson, and you will enjoy that a lot more, in my opinion. James Robinson had 12.3 fantasy points against Tennessee. I'm not sure what this 19.62. Maybe that's what he is averaging this season. He only had 16 touches, no touchdowns. And he's got Baltimore, Chicago, and Indianapolis coming up. All really good defenses, all really good against the run. James Robinson is a Rookie of the Year candidate. He's been very good. I think you're going to have to possibly press the panic button on him for the sheer fact that he finishes the season out against all very good rushing defenses. And he's a guy that normally was getting you around 20 points, and if the expectation now is only 12, you got to make up for those 8 points somewhere else. So I'm going to hit the panic button on James Robinson for the sheer fact of his matchups to close out this season. Next, we have Adam Thielen. He only had 3 receptions on 4 targets last week for 6.9 fantasy points. He was out-targeted by Irv Smith and Justin Jefferson and only had the same amount of targets as Dalvin Cook, who is the running back. He's got Chicago next week, New Orleans after that, and Detroit after that. I'm not entirely sure. I didn't grab what he had against Chicago the first time, but I know that it was a big game for Justin Jefferson in their last game against Chicago. So, I don't know if Adam Thielen possibly takes that over, but Adam Thielen was active in that same game. I believe that Adam actually had 2 touchdowns in that game. We're going to look that up, because if Adam Thielen had touchdowns against Chicago the last time they played, then I will not panic on him. Yeah, so Adam Thielen last time against Chicago, only 4 catches for 43 yards, but he did have 2 touchdowns. because I'm not too worried about the matchup with New Orleans, and I'm also not worried about the matchup with Detroit. Everything is completely dependent on the play calling for Minnesota and whether or not Kirk Cousins wants to throw him the ball. You never know what Kirk Cousins you're going to get. You never know who he's going to throw the ball to. But I guess at least if he's looking for Adam Thielen for touchdowns, that's a good sign for you. So we're going to go no panic on Adam Thielen. Deontay Johnson, another tanker for my league. He had 2 early drops this past week and disappeared for a lot of the game. He did have 7 targets in the game, but only had 4 receptions for 40 yards, which materialized to 8 points and probably a loss for your team. He plays Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and Cleveland coming up. And honestly, I think if he can actually catch the ball and not drop it, shocker, he's going to have a big game. But as we saw this past week, Mike Tomlin's not going to put up with the drops. If Deontay drops it, he's going to disappear to the bench for a little bit. And you don't need that in this fantasy playoffs. So I think you hit the panic button on Deontay Johnson. You find another option, because if he has a drop, Tomlin's going to pull him, and he will have another 8 points and probably lose you fantasy playoffs. Then we have Tyler Lockett to finish up Panic Room. His last 3 games, 3 catches, 6 catches, 5 catches, no touchdowns. All of that materializing into 5.3, 12.3, and 10.2 points in the last 3 weeks. He's only averaging 8.3 points per game since week 8. And he's running through a gauntlet of defenses to finish off the season. He's got Washington, the Rams, and San Francisco. I think you hit the panic button on Tyler Lockett. DK Metcalf has taken over that wide receiver role. And when it comes down to it, if Russell Wilson is looking and in trouble, he's going to go to DK. And again, 3 really tough defenses. So I think you panic on Lockett and look for something different. That was the Panic Room. You may now take off your straitjacket and calm down, unless the segment did not help you at all. In which case, stay in that jacket as we move on to fantasy or reality.
Is it all just a fantasy, or is this reality?
Welcome into fantasy or reality. This segment is a test to see if these performances from the last week were fantasy or reality, and if we can trust these stats going forward. We're going to start out with Drew Lock. He was a top 10 quarterback this week with 284 passing yards and 4 touchdowns for 25.6 fantasy points. You know what? I'm saying he could be startable if you have a quarterback in the Panic Room. Except for, I think this is fantasy. He's got Buffalo, the Chargers, and Las Vegas left on the schedule. I think this game more is a good hope towards the future, as in next season. But Buffalo is a decent defense. The Chargers and the Raiders, Drew Lock didn't play well against them the last time they played. And, Drew Lock not throwing interceptions. Well, I guess if he doesn't throw any more interceptions, that'd be great. But he's Drew Lock. I watch a different podcast, and they call him Mr. Irresponsible. And that word, I don't think there's a more accurate word for Drew Lock. As a Broncos fan, I would love to see him continue to throw 4 touchdowns and no interceptions. and possibly the Broncos win out this season. But I think it's fantasy, and I don't think you can trust Drew Lock going forward unless you're in full desperation mode. Then you have Mitchell Trubisky with 290 passing yards, 3 touchdowns for 24.98 fantasy points. He's also somebody you could start if you have a quarterback in the panic room. In this one, I actually may believe. He's got Minnesota, Jacksonville, and Green Bay coming up. And his connection with Allen Robinson has been great. Honestly, I think this could be reality. It's not. These aren't like blow it up numbers. They're just consistent, normal quarterback numbers. And against Minnesota and Jacksonville, at least, neither one of those defenses is going to put up a whole lot of fight. Green Bay may. But I think Mitchell Trubisky definitely is somebody you could start if you have somebody in the panic room. There's a possibility I could look at him instead of Justin Herbert this week because 24 points looks a whole lot better than 14. So Mitchell Trubisky, I think it's a reality. David Montgomery had 14 touches, 155 yards, and a touchdown in his last game for 24.5 fantasy points. He has 4 touchdowns in the last 3 weeks, and his scores the last 3 weeks are 25.3, 27.1, and 24.5. He's got Minnesota, Jacksonville, and Green Bay coming up. He could be a league winner, and I honestly think so. He didn't do anything all year. Regardless of what the matchup was, he didn't take advantage of it. But now, going into right before the playoffs and now in the playoffs, he's been lighting it up. And I think you can trust him. And he's going to be a league winner if you continue to play him. Jonathan Taylor had 22 touches, 165 yards, and 2 touchdowns for 30.5 fantasy points in last week's game. His last 3 games have been gradually increasing from 15.4 to 22.5 and then 30.5 this last week. He has Houston, Pittsburgh, and Jacksonville coming up. He is a must start for the rest of the playoffs. Honestly, if you have somebody like Aaron Jones and you can get your hands on Jonathan Taylor, I would say so. I think this one is just dependent on what you have. But in my case, I would love to have a Jonathan Taylor right now. So I'm going to say it is reality. He's got a really good matchup against Houston. Pittsburgh, who knows? They've been just playing really weird lately. And then Jacksonville is another great matchup. So I think this is reality that Jonathan Taylor is a must start for the rest of the playoffs. Moving on to T.Y. Hilton. He had 5 receptions for 86 yards and 2 touchdowns for 25.6 fantasy points this past week. And he's had 25 points or more in the last 2 games and 4 touchdowns in his last 3. He plays Houston, Pittsburgh, and Jacksonville. And he could be a league winner. I don't want to trust T.Y. Hilton. I don't want to trust him because he was non-existent until 3 weeks ago. But against Houston, Pittsburgh, and Jacksonville, I think T.Y. Hilton, this is reality. Phillip Rivers is looking for him now. He's found him. He's found a chemistry with him. And I think he can continue to at least get a touchdown in every game because that's where Phillip's looking for him. And, if you plug him in, 25 points as compared to whatever you may be getting with, say, Deontay Johnson, he could be a league winner for you. Moving on to Brandon Ayuk. 10 receptions for 119 yards last week, had 21.9 fantasy points without even scoring a touchdown. He's had 17 plus in every week since week 6. And in the last 5 weeks, he's scored 17.5, 23.1, 19.7, 20.5, and 21.9. There's no Debo now. Debo probably will not play the rest of the season. And these matchups are great. Dallas, Arizona, and Seattle. Brandon Ayuk could be a league winner. Yes, he could. And I am hoping he is, because I am playing him in my secondary league. And with his 21 extra points, I would be in the lead right now from last week. So I believe it is reality with Brandon Ayuk possibly being a league winner for you. We're going to skip over Mike Gesicki with his injury. It's obviously fantasy because he probably will not be playing. Moving on to Irv Smith Jr. He had 4 catches for 63 yards and a touchdown. He had more targets than Adam Thielen in the last game. And he's got Chicago, New Orleans, and Detroit coming up. His is a little more manageable. Could be a top 10 tight end the rest of the season. 16.3 fantasy points last week. I'm going to go ahead and say, I think it's fantasy. I mean, this offense revolves around Dalvin Cook, Adam Thielen, and Justin Jefferson. I think Irv Smith will continue to get four catches for around 50 yards, but I don't think he's going to get a touchdown every week from here on out. Chicago, New Orleans, and Detroit. Chicago and New Orleans are not good matchups. So Irv Smith, it's the tight end position. So if you want to roll with it. But I think it is fantasy that Irv Smith could be a top 10 tight end for the rest of the season. And to finish off the fantasy or reality, we've got TJ Hawkinson. He had 6 catches for 43 yards and a touchdown last week. He's got 10 plus points in the last 4 weeks. Those scores being 10.8, 13.9, 15.4, and 16.3 this past week. And he's got Tampa Bay, Tennessee, and Minnesota coming up. He could be a weak equalizer. And yes, this is totally reality. I mean, you've seen it the past 4 weeks. It's not lighted up numbers, but 10 points or more, and it keeps going up every week. TJ Hawkinson, he's somebody that could, equalize your matchup and make up some points if the person you are playing does not have a great tight end. So I think this is reality. TJ Hawkinson being a weak equalizer. That is it for fantasy or reality. Let's move on to trust or bust.
Can we trust you, or are you going to bust our playoffs?
Welcome into Trust or Bust. This segment is going to be pretty fun. There are some players who have lit up fantasy scoreboards in the past few weeks, and I'm going to tell you if you can trust these players or if these players will bust your playoff dreams. We're going to start off with Baker Mayfield. His next 3 matchups are the Giants, the Jets, and the Steelers. So Baker, in the last 3 games, has 8 touchdowns. In his past 2 games, he's got 300 passing yards and has scored 29.46 and 30.02 fantasy points. The matchup with the Giants, you look at the Giants and you're like, oh yeah, this is a decent matchup. Well, the Giants have only allowed 3 20-point games to quarterbacks, nothing more than that, and give up an average of 17.62 fantasy points. But then you look at the Jets, they've given up 5 30-point games to quarterbacks, and they give up an average of 25.38 fantasy points to quarterbacks. And then you got Pittsburgh, who has given up 6 20-point games to quarterbacks, but only give up an average of 15.85. And the last time he played Pittsburgh, he only scored 5.26 fantasy points. Do we trust Baker Mayfield? Do we not? I don't know if you trust him against the Giants or the Steelers, but you definitely trust him against the Jets. This upcoming week is probably the semifinal matchup for you. And it's the Giants. Depending on how your league is, if the New York Jets are your championship game, and you are in the championship, I think you can trust Baker Mayfield. But if you have to go into that Pittsburgh game for your fantasy championship, I say you don't trust him. So the trust or bust on Baker Mayfield is completely reliant on when your fantasy championship is. I'm going to go ahead and say you trust him. He's been playing really well. The Browns have been playing really well. And he's got 8 touchdowns in the last 3 games. That's more than 2 touchdowns a game. Nearly 3 touchdowns a game. So I say you trust Baker Mayfield, you roll with it, and you hopefully get some 30-point games out of him. Moving on, we have Derek Carr. His next 3 matchups are the Los Angeles Chargers, the Miami Dolphins, and the Denver Broncos. He has 6 games of 20-plus points and only 1 game of 30-plus. But he's had a few weeks inside the top 10. He's playing the Chargers first, who give up 21.46 fantasy points to quarterbacks. But Derek Carr only scored 14 in their last matchup. Then he's got Miami, who gives up 18 points to quarterbacks, and Denver, who gives up 19.92 fantasy points to quarterbacks. And the last time he played Denver, he only scored 7.16 fantasy points. I'm going to say bust. Derek Carr will bust your lineup and bust your playoff dreams if you keep him in. Moving on to Jonathan Taylor. His next 3 matchups are Houston, Pittsburgh, and Jacksonville. 25.5 and 30.5 were his lines the last 2 weeks. And he has 8 games of 10-plus points and 6 games of 15-plus points. His Houston matchup, Houston gives up 24.85 fantasy points to running backs on average. And the last time they played, he had 22.5 points. Then he's got Pittsburgh, who only gives up 12.69 fantasy points to running backs. And then Jacksonville, who gives up 21.77 fantasy points. And the last time he played them, which would have been week 1, he had 14.9 fantasy points. And he's obviously come a long way from that. Jonathan Taylor, oh man, it's just so hard with that Colts backfield. But I'm going to go ahead and say you trust Jonathan Taylor. You let him just drive your fantasy car right into the championship. And hopefully he gives you more 20 to 30 point games. Moving on to Cam Akers. His next 3 matchups are gold. You have the New York Jets, the Seattle Seahawks, and the Arizona Cardinals. He has 20-plus carries in the last 2 games. The first game of that being 21 carries for 72 yards and a touchdown. The game after that, 29 carries, 171 yards. And in the last 2 weeks, here's a fun stat. He has 50 carries of the 58 running back carries for the Rams in the last 2 weeks. Obviously is taking over that lead role. Sean McVay is giving him the ball, saying, go after it, buddy. And in the last 3 weeks, Cam Akers has scored 14.4 fantasy points, 16.4 fantasy points, and 21.4 fantasy points. And I think it's just going to continually go up. I think this week especially, he will have more than 21, as he's playing the Jets, who give up 16.31 fantasy points. I think he's going to get another 25 to 30 carries, 100 yards, and a touchdown. And against Seattle, they give up even more at 17 points, and Arizona gives up the most with 17.5 fantasy points. So you see his numbers gradually going up. You see these matchups. The defenses give up gradually more points. I think you trust Cam Akers and let the man win you a fantasy championship. All right, we got T.Y. Hilton. He's got Houston, Pittsburgh, and Jacksonville. 18.1 fantasy points, 25 and 25.6 in the last 3 weeks. 4 touchdowns in the last 3 weeks. He has 4 or more receptions and 80 or more yards in the last 3 weeks. He's got Houston, who gives up 24.77 fantasy points to wide receivers. And the last time he played Houston, he had 8 catches for 110 yards and a touchdown for 25 fantasy points in their last matchup. Then he's got Pittsburgh and Jacksonville. Pittsburgh gives up 23.08 and Jacksonville gives up 25.8. I hate the fact that T.Y. Hilton's actually doing something. And I honestly can't remember what I said in fantasy or reality. But what I'm feeling right now is you got to trust him. You just got to trust him. Especially this upcoming week against Houston. Looks like he loves playing Houston. So I say you trust T.Y. Hilton. And then finally we have Brandon Ayuk. He, again, has those wonderful matchups of Dallas, Arizona, Seattle. 17 points or more in 5 games this week, or 5 games this year, and has 5 or more receptions in the last 5 weeks. Again, he's got no Debo. He scored 21.9 fantasy points without a touchdown last week. And he's heavily targeted. I mean, 10 catches for 119 yards. The guy's turning into a really, really good wide receiver. And then when you have Dallas giving up 26.9 points, 22.15 from Arizona, and 27 from Seattle, you definitely trust Brandon Ayuk. Did I say anybody was going to bust you? Yeah, I did. One person, Derek Carr. Yeah. So, trust Brandon Ayuk. He's going to blow up for you. He's got no Debo to hold him back. Give the man a roll of the dice. That was Trust or Bust.
Prime time football.
You got your Thursday matchup next tomorrow. You got the Chargers and the Raiders. I really needed to be a turnaround game for the Chargers with Justin Herbert and Keenan Allen. They need to start hooking up and find something. Taking on the Raiders with Derek Carr, Josh Jacobs. I mean, I'm not liking the outlook with Josh Jacobs just being a tool with fantasy football and Derek Carr just being inconsistent. I think you take a flyer on the Chargers. I think for some reason that offense is actually going to do something this week, and the Raiders are just going to take a poop skis on everything because they're the Raiders. Moving on, we got the Bills and Broncos and Panthers and Packers on Saturday. The Bills are 96% chance favorites to win this game. The under over sitting at 49.5. And honestly, Buffalo's defense hasn't been fantastic lately. And if Drew Lock can go out there and not throw interceptions, maybe the Broncos got a chance, Maybe. And I'm really just hoping for the tanking of Josh Allen these next few weeks just to make me feel better about not having him anymore. Then you have the Panthers and Packers. I think you still obviously got to take the Packers in this game. I believe it's going to be no Christian McCaffrey again. And you obviously have Aaron Rodgers and Devontae Adams that are going to be doing what they do, scoring 100 fantasy points a week. But Aaron Jones, again, do you start Aaron Jones? It's hard to not start Aaron Jones, but there's some people like Cam Akers, Jonathan Taylor. I'd probably start them over Aaron Jones just because I feel like they're actually going to be appreciated by their offense and used by their offense. But Packers are going to win that one as well. Then we move on to the Buccaneers and the Falcons. I think the Buccaneers got this. I think Tom Brady, Mike Evans, Rob Gronkowski, maybe even Scotty Miller, all have days that are usable in fantasy. More Tom Brady than anything. But this backfield is going to be a little shaky. Ronald Jones probably won't play, so you've got like Leonard Fournette, LaShawn McCoy. I think, but is it really going to matter? The Buccaneers never run the ball anyway. But the Buccaneers are going to take out the Falcons there. And I don't think you can trust Matt Ryan or Todd Gurley or anybody. I think the only person you can trust is Calvin Ridley, because regardless of how bad Matt Ryan will be, Calvin Ridley is still Calvin Ridley and still would be good. I think Matt Ryan last week scored like 4 fantasy points or something like that. Calvin Ridley still was a top 10 guy. So, yeah. Moving on. We got the Bears and the Vikings. This one's interesting. Very interesting. On the Bears side, you got Mitch Trubisky, and he has revived Allen Robinson. And you got David Montgomery running all over everybody. And then on the other side, you got the Vikings, you got Dalvin Cook, you got Justin Jefferson, you got Adam Thielen, but they're all hankered down by Kirk Cousins. Honestly, I would love to see the Vikings win, and I would love to see Justin Jefferson score me 20 more points. I just don't know if that's going to be the case. Man, this one's tough. We'll have to come back to that one because I am not sure how I feel about that game. That's real tough. Sitting at 71% for the Vikings at an over-under of 47. I don't know. That seems like a decent over-under. But I don't know why that many people are that sure Vikings over the Bears. Oh no, we'll come back to that one. Then you have the 49ers and Cowboys. That's going to be a dumpster fire of a game. I think you take the 49ers and Brandon Ayuk, Jeff Wilson. Put them guys in. Anyone else? Probably not. At all. Moving on, we got the Lions and the Titans. You're obviously starting Derrick Henry. Hopefully for you, he gets another 39 to 40 points. Hopefully for your opponent, he does not. Then you got like Corey Davis, A.J. Brown. I think you start A.J. Brown for sure. Corey Davis. I don't know. I haven't trusted Corey Davis all year, and it's bit me in the butt a few times. But on the other side, with the Lions, DeAndre Swift, hopefully you have him and you can play him because I think it's at least 15 points out of him. Other than that, on the Lions side of the ball, Matt Stafford may or may not play. I think if Matt Stafford plays, you can still play like Marvin Jones and TJ Hawkinson. I think you could play TJ Hawkinson regardless as well because of, backup quarterbacks come in. the biggest guy on the field is the tight end, and that's who they're going to see. So I think you can start him regardless as well. But I think the Titans pretty easily take that game over the Lions. And then we got the Texans and the Colts. I wish the Texans were more consistent because they can go out there and have a great game, score 48 some odd points. Sean Watson can go out there and light everybody up. Brandon Cooks is coming back. I think he's startable, as is Deshaun Watson. Anybody else on that offense, I would steer away from. And then in the Colts, on the Colts side, you got Jonathan Taylor. I think you start him. Phillip Rivers, probably not unless, again, you're desperate. And then possibly T.Y. Hilton. I mean, I hate to say after all year that you would start T.Y. Hilton, but you just might. And I just might. I've got him, so I might do it. But the Colts, I believe, are going to take that matchup. Unless the Texans, just start throwing bombs, which they've been known to do out of nowhere sometimes, so who knows. And then we got the Patriots and the Dolphins. Whew. We're in 2020 when the Dolphins are easily the pick over the Patriots. The Patriots have just looked terrible. And was it against the Rams a few weeks ago that would have been last week that they scored 21 points, I think, against the Patriots offense? So the Dolphins defense, I think you smash that play. You could probably start Tua. I don't know. Is Devontae Parker back at all? That's a great question, but you're not going to have Mike Gesicki. I don't think you start Cam Newton on the other side. I don't think you start anybody on the other side for the Patriots at all. Yep, that's what we're going with. Dolphins are going to win. Start Tua. And is Myles Gaskin back? I don't know. All things I should know, but I don't. Moving on, we have Seattle taking on the Washington football team. Let's see. This one's interesting. 86% say Seattle. If Alex Smith is still in there, you aren't playing Alex Smith fantasy-wise, but Terry McLaurin, Logan Thomas, those are two guys that you need them to have a quarterback to help them out. And I think if they stay competitive against the Seahawks, which is also tough because, the Washington football team's defense is very good. So you don't just have the automatic, let's start everybody against Washington. You start Chris Carson, you start Russell Wilson, and I think you start DK Metcalf. And beyond that, I don't think you worry about Tyler Lockett. I think you look at somewhere else instead of him. And then on the Washington side, again, maybe Terry McLaurin, maybe Logan Thomas, maybe J.D. McKissick. But none of those are go for it right away. I'm starting Logan Thomas if that helps anybody at tight end. Then you got the Ravens and Jaguars. If you have James Robinson, you're probably going to have to start him anyway. Other than that, don't start anybody for the Jaguars. On the other side, hopefully you get another huge game out of Lamar Jackson because you're going to start him. I would start Gus Edwards for sure. Gus Edwards has kind of taken over. I mean, I don't think the Ravens quite think that, but just statistically, Gus Edwards is pretty dang good, and I think they should keep giving him the ball. So you can start him, and then Mark Andrews, you can definitely start. Hollywood Brown, I don't know. You make that decision on your own. I'm tired of trying to figure out what Hollywood Brown's going to do. All right, then we got the Jets and the Rams. Start everybody. Honestly, I mean, you could probably start Jared Goff. You could definitely start Robert Woods, Cooper Kupp, and Cameron Akers. Definitely start them. Don't start anybody for the Jets. Don't do it. Don't put yourself in that position. Doesn't need to happen. Moving on, we got a battle of the birds. We got Eagles. We got Cardinals. Jalen Hurts, think you can start him. Miles Sanders, think you can start him. Receiver-wise, I have no idea what you should do. To be honest, Jalen Reagor, Travis Fulgham, Alshon Jeffrey, Dallas Goedert, Zach Ertz. I think you start Dallas Goedert. And I'm just saying that because I think I'm starting him in one league. No, I'm starting Logan Thomas instead. But he's a guy that I think you can still start. Receiver-wise, I would probably look elsewhere. I just don't know how that's going to go. And then on the Cardinal side, you're obviously starting Kyler Murray. You're starting DeAndre Hopkins. Ian Thomas, is that their tight end? I may even start him, I think he's gotten a touchdown the last 2 games, and one of them's been a 2-touchdown game, so go for it. Kenyon Drake, I'd steer away. I'd look for something different, for sure. But who's going to win that game? Man. Part of me wants to go with the upset and say the Eagles are going to take it. Because the Cardinals, I don't know. And I did not expect the Eagles to win last week. Especially the way they did. You know what? I'm behind in my pick'ems. So I'm going to go with the Eagles. Why not? All right. Then we got the Chiefs and we got the Saints. That's a very good matchup. That's going to be a fun game to watch, I think. I believe Taysom Hill is still going to be their quarterback. I think you can start him. Had I started Taysom Hill last week, would have given me a few extra points. Anyway, Alvin Kamara, definitely starting him. Jared Cook, I think you got to start just because, he's a top 10 receiver this last week. He's going to get a few targets at least. And who else do you have at tight end? Exactly. On the Chiefs side, start everybody. Besides maybe Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Le'Veon Bell. But you're starting all the big ones. You're starting Mahomes. You're starting Kelsey. You're starting Hill. And hopefully all of those players do absolutely fantastic for you. Moving on, we got the Browns and Giants, and honestly, this is a fun game to think about. I mean, 92% say the Browns. The Browns have been playing well, but the Giants the Giants beat the Seahawks a couple weeks ago. So, what do we think about the Giants? I don't know. I think the Browns are just playing really well. And if they play anywhere near as well as they did against the Ravens, who are just overall a better team, I think they easily take the Giants. But the Giants, they're fighters and anything could happen. And I believe that's the Sunday night matchup. Let's see. Yeah, the Sunday night matchup, right? Yep. So, prime time. Let's see what happens. And then to finish off the week, we got the Steelers and Bengals. Man, this makes it so hard to not start Deontay Johnson. I'm not starting Deontay Johnson this week, but he's playing the Bengals, and I think you start him. I think you start him. Chase Claypool, maybe even a flex option. Juju, maybe a flex or wide receiver 2. Big Ben, I guess consequently, if you're going to start any of those guys, Big Ben you could start. James Conner, steer away from that guy. I don't think so. On the Bengals side, yep, that's it. That's it. I don't think you start anybody for the Bengals. So that is that. Yeah. All right. So that was our matchups. That's it for this week's show. Thank you all for listening once again. Go out there and win some championships. I wish you all the best of luck, and I hope you send me some well wishes to advance in my secondary league. Again, as I'm not even in my own league anymore, but, enough dwelling on that. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe. I'm Ricky Larson. I'll see you all next week.